Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you today nearly live. We're in Washington, D.C., national capital of the United States, and I've been here for 3 days, and I'm already moving slower. I'm just following along with the politicians and being very sluggish. But we're here, part of the Popular Culture Association National Conferences here in the United States. And I have to say, out of all the conferences I've ever been to, this is by far the biggest. It's huge. There's something like 42, 43 panels going on at once. There's tons of people around. A little overwhelming when I first got here, but it's been a lot of fun. And one of the better presentations I've seen was this morning, part of the food and history panel, or overall section area, coming in to talk to us about restaurants and going out to eat in American life. Kelly Erby from Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. And so you were talking this morning about the rise of restaurants and sort of what that means, and it's part of a larger work for you. And we were just saying that it's interesting that it's not like restaurants have always existed. So when did really the restaurants come about? When did people start to eat out of the home on a regular basis?
So that's a good question. So Europe has a really old tradition of going out to eat, and cook shops that goes back all the way to the medieval time, if not before. But in America, you really don't have restaurants until the early 19th century. And it's the beginnings of industrialization and increasing urbanization that really causes Americans to start to look to go out to eat. Big reason was as home and work became increasingly separated spaces, men would find that they needed commercial options in the middle of the day to get something to eat without trekking all the way back home.
Mm-hmm. But then the question is, why not just, today you just say, just take a sandwich?
Yeah, and people did that. And there was street food available too, people just hawking things. But increasingly, late 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, you have this whole culture of restaurants and dining out that develops.
Right. So and what sort of food are these places serving then? I mean, is it distinct from the home? Is it that much different? Or are they trying to replicate what people would get at home?
Well, so it depends. Very quickly, once people started going out to restaurants, you had a really variegated restaurant landscape. And by that I mean there were lots of different kinds of restaurants.
Right.
There were some of the first restaurants were they catered toward the elite, and they served very elite, sort of modeled often on French cuisine, or what Americans thought French cuisine was, which is often kind of funny. So you have, those kinds of restaurants. Examples in New York would be like Delmonico's, in Boston, the Tremont House and the Parker House. But then you also have what were called eating houses, which were sort of like the 19th century version of fast food. You would pop in, you would more often than not just sort of stand along a counter and eat. And the whole goal of the eating house was to just eat as quickly as possible. And those, I wouldn't say that the food in these more plebeian dining spots was all that different from what was available in American homes, modeled on Anglo-American cuisine, very focused on meats and pastries. So it's not that it's all that different, it's just that it provides this convenience factor of being able to eat when you're downtown.
Right, and so you mentioned that this is part of industrialization, that so men now are working in these urban areas and need something to eat, and so it's really it's not really this organic thing of this idea of, hey, what if we just go out to eat? It's more out of a necessity that this rises.
Yeah, at least for the vast majority of non-elite people, it's convenience that drives them to want to go out to eat.
Okay, so this is obviously there's class roles
definitely
going on here.
Definitely.
So what effect then does this have on social hierarchies, the rise of restaurants? Is it sort of like, I guess it's not even that different as today. It's like you go to a certain place in part because it has this reputation as a nicer place, as opposed to going, I don't want to name any names of specific places, unless I get emails. But
yeah, I mean, social hierarchy is very much present in the dining landscape. I mean, the social hierarchies are sort of mirrored back in the dining landscape. Mm-hmm. I say that, but I think in important ways the dining landscape also complicated social hierarchy, and I'll give you one example. Not everywhere, but at least in Boston, which is the city that I spend most of my time studying, blacks who were segregated and not welcomed into other areas, they were allowed to eat in many eating houses. You also had African Americans present as workers in restaurants. Restaurants were one of the few non-segregated workplaces. Now, obviously, encountering a black person as a worker is not the same thing as encountering them as a fellow patron, but I do think that there were ways in which certain hierarchies kind of broke down within restaurants.
And then there's also a gender hierarchy going on as well,
yes.
right? So what's that all about? And the idea of women have to be segregated unless they have a man with them, or vice versa. So what's going on there?
Yes, ideally, women were supposed to limit their engagement with the public commercial sphere in the 19th century, early 19th century. Women do start going out to eat. For women, the reasons that they need to go out to eat are different from men. It's not so much female workers who go out to eat. There is a growing number of employed women in this period, but they're employed in domestic spaces typically. So, like, the number one employer was domestic service for women. And so they would just eat in the settings in which they worked. But non-employed middle class and more affluent women, they did find that they needed commercial options because they would often be out of the home engaging in reform activities or increasingly shopping. And so there was this whole other range of eateries that opened. They catered specifically to women. And men, in order to provide like a protected, chaste environment for women, because the idea was that women needed to be protected, men were not allowed in these spaces, except if they were in the escort of a woman. If they happened to be escorting a woman, then they would be permitted. So yeah, gender hierarchy is definitely present. Women were not welcomed into the venues that men tended to go to, because that was thought to be improper, put women's respectability at risk.
So in that context, then, there's a lot of discussion. You talked about this. This was, I think, probably maybe the crux of the paper that you presented this morning, this idea of how this impacts family structure. And you were talking mostly in the mid-19th century.
Yeah.
So 1840s, 1850s.
Yeah, 50s, 60s.
What is the impact then on the family structure? Because, a lot of what is made, or what you were talking about, was that the family meal was a major part of family relationships, family dynamics. And now you take that away, and the whole structure of the family changes in a sense, right?
Yeah, so this is really a problem that pertained to the middle class, who, in my paper today, I talked about kind of the irony is that the idea of the family mealtime really doesn't have much significance until this 1830s, 1840s. So in other words, like the restaurant and the family, the concept of like sitting down as a family to dinner, those are two things that more or less sprang up in about the same time. And the middle class was really worried that as men in particular, but also women to some extent, ceased coming home for the midday meal, which in this period was the main meal of the day, was in the middle of the day, that would undermine morality, that they were sacrificing family relationships built on love and virtue and morality for these public, anonymous, commercial relationships in restaurants. And the middle class in particular was really very concerned about that.
But so when you say middle class, though, is it even just a segment of the middle class? Because I think you used the term social reformers. Mm-hmm. So who are those people? Like, obviously, the middle class is pretty eclectic on its own. So the people who are really concerned are making us think about this. What is their real motivation behind it? What's their perspective, other than the fact that, yes, the family dynamic might be going away, but what do they care if it's not, like, as long as their family's okay? Like, why do they care about everybody else?
So I think it's a good question. I think it's more the idea of it, that this is happening more and more often, and domesticity and the idea of the family became a way that the middle class kind of distinguished itself from both those below and above them. In other words, the middle class sort of depicted themselves as somehow more virtuous than both the upper classes and the lower classes, because they had these family values. They valued the home. It was also a way to preserve their social standing. Don't spend too much money, don't engage too frivolously in consumption. That was kind of a way to preserve their economic standing. So it's really more the idea that these things are happening because they continue to engage in these activities even though it's very similar to what's happening today. Like we talk about the decline in family values. Nobody sits down to dinner together anymore.
Yeah.
But yet we still go out to eat.
Right. But then I guess the question is, and maybe it feeds back to the industrialization thing, that what's the difference if the family meal happens in a restaurant or at home?
Well, see, that's the problem, is that in the 1850s, 1860s, the family meal couldn't happen in a restaurant because restaurants were gender segregated.
Right.
And that's actually something that changes later in the century, but in this moment, it's restaurants actually prevented family members from coming together to share a meal.
Which is kind of weird. In a sense, like what's the difference? I mean, it's a family.
It's really, I mean, it's
but
different from today for sure.
But that would be part of industrialization as well, right? That if the main meal is happening in the middle of the day, and it's the men who are off in the urban setting working, they're the ones who are just going to go out together,
right?
So
yeah.
there's not even a need then to have, like, the rule exists that it's men only, but. Like, how often would that even have been challenged?
Well, and so that's another reason, I think, that both the restaurant and the idea of the family meal, they're born partly out of these increasingly specialized roles for men and women. I mean, before, men and women had, when, there's less of a distinction in work patterns, men and women had interacted more throughout the day with their children in the home, home and work sort of took place in the same space. But now, because of industrialization, men and women are increasingly segregated and they don't interact as much throughout the day.
And talking about these social reformers now who are concerned about what's going on.
Right.
I shouldn't say what is their end goal, because we sort of know what their end goal is, to get people to relate to each other more in a family setting. But how do they go about trying to get people to do that? What is their strategy? What sort of efforts are they undertaking? Is it maybe a public relations campaign with flyers and pamphlets? Or are they doing going door to door? Like what are they trying? How are they trying to achieve this?
Yeah, so they basically launch a big campaign to sort of herald the sanctity of the family meal. Even though, again, the family meal is something that's really just been born, and they publish pamphlets. But more than that, they write in newspapers and periodicals. There's this slew of cookbooks that come out that talk about the importance of the family meal and how to instructing women on how to serve this meal. They talk about all of the health benefits to eating at home as opposed to going out. I mean, they talk about how it saves you money. I mean, all of this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? I mean, This is exactly the conversation today.
But at least in part today, it's because, well, no one has any money. And just even, and let's go back to, I want to talk about the health thing, because it's something that you talked about today in the presentation. And I mean, today I think you can make a legitimate claim that eating out on a regular basis isn't healthy.
That it contributes to obesity.
Yeah, and unless you're being smart about it, because to go into a restaurant, and even to go in, like, these studies that you see when you order a salad at a place, it has like 3,000 calories, and it's all this other stuff that
because
shouldn't
there's
be
like
in
a breaded chicken breast
on
top of the salad.
Yeah, so like so the health aspect today is played up, and it seems legitimate today. Were the same concerns real back then? Yes.
Well, so the funny thing to me, and this is actually part of what drew me to this project, is that they say so much of the same things in the mid-19th century as they say today about how this is bad for you, that this encourages overeating, it encourages indulgence, and that it will cause, the big fear in the 19th century is dyspepsia, which is this disease that's related to indigestion, and that this will cause all sorts of debility. But I think what is different about the mid-19th century is that there's also this big focus on morality and how, and again, this is a middle class thing, where the idea is that overeating will lead to engaging in other kinds of indulgences that will end up being bad for you morally, but also bad for your health.
Right, because one of the things you said, something like with women, it was like, if your appetite is for sale, then everything else would be for sale. Like the mindset is so.
Well, I think
it seems outrageous.
Well, it is. It does to us today. But I think in the mid-19th century, there was this very real anxiety about the market and the market economy, and that this is a place of excess. This is a place of temptation. This is a place of corruption. We don't understand this yet, and so we want to limit our engagement with it. I mean, today we don't have those. Everything is for sale in America today.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always like that. And I think that part of why I like restaurants so much is that it provides a window into a moment where people were very anxious about putting their appetites up for sale.
One of the other health concerns, too, that you talked about is that these places are serving alcohol. And the concern of alcohol consumption, and maybe not even just alcohol. You talk about coffee and tea and
yes,
other...
so-called stimulants.
Right. And the danger associated with that. And one of the things I thought was interesting was the idea that the social reformers don't like the restaurants because, and particularly women, can go and consume these things outside of the glare of their family and the danger that would provide. And, well, one, is that real? Or were women actually doing this, going out by themselves, or maybe as groups or whatever, with the idea that they could consume these things without anyone else knowing? And two, was it, if that's the case, was it really all that dangerous?
So temperance is a huge cause in the 19th century, huge reform effort surrounding temperance. And it wasn't just the middle class. I mean, this spanned all classes. But it was particularly important to the middle class, I think, because of their overall focus on moderation. So they were concerned that in a lot of these restaurants, alcohol was available. Let me just read quickly a quote from one periodical that kind of, I think, provides the flavor of this concern. What harm in the eating house, do you ask? If the eating house were only an eating house, it wouldn't be so bad, but it is a drinking house too, side by side with the steaming hot meats and vegetables which are to tempt your palate and fill your stomach are the fiery hot drinks with which you are invited to consume body and soul.
That's a great quote.
Yeah, so I think that sort of reflects part of what they're afraid of. As far as women are concerned, though, the restaurants that well-heeled, meaning middle class and more affluent women went to, absolutely did not serve alcohol. That was part of the way that they made themselves safe for women, is that they eliminated alcohol because there were these really long associations between commercial sex and commercial alcohol. So, like, to prevent themselves from being taken as a prostitute, women couldn't go to restaurants that served alcohol. And yet, there's this huge concern that that's exactly what they're doing when they go to a ladies' eatery. Is that, and I talked this morning in my paper that people were really kind of hysterical and paranoid in their concerns about this. Like, they thought that perhaps these restaurants were hiding alcohol in the bonbons they served women, or, spiking their lemonade. And I think that sort of reflects kind of a hysterical paranoia with, what is going on in this new market world.
But then out of that, I wonder what is the allure of the restaurants then, both for men and for women. I mean, if these sort of the forbidden aspect of it, if those concerns that these social reformers are talking about aren't really all that legitimate, then what is the allure? I mean, is the allure any different from why we go to restaurants today? Or is there something specific in the early 19th century that makes restaurants more popular?
So I think there was a lot that was, very alluring about a restaurant, going to restaurants in the mid-19th century. They're convenient, first of all, particularly for working men. But also, I think a lot of people comment, particularly Europeans who come to America to visit, they comment on Americans' love of being out in public, to see and be seen kind of thing like that. Particularly in urban areas, that's something that seems to have very quickly been very appealing to many Americans and part of, the novelty of the experience of going out to eat.
And that would be part too, like, because taverns were popular in the 18th century, right? But and we talked just before we started recording that you can't really consider those restaurants. Because they're not really serving food, but
or they're serving food, but they're serving food mostly to travelers,
right? Or
like a special occasion banquet,
right? So it's not a restaurant in the strict sense of the word, restaurant,
right?
But they would serve a similar purpose, and that a lot of times they could be meeting houses and a social area. And I know to put it into a Canadian context, Johnny McDonald would have cabinet meetings, not official cabinet meetings, but he would have cabinet meetings in a tavern. So the tavern would serve that social role, which now restaurants then could start to fill in a different way, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and you mentioned the issue of race a little bit. We were talking about social hierarchies. 1840s, 1850s, I'm not an expert in American history, but it seems as though the tensions over slavery and free states and slave states were really starting to come to a head.
Definitely.
And at some point in the 1850s, it gets to the point where war seems inevitable.
I would not use the word inevitable, but
likely.
But maybe likely by the late 1850s.
Okay, so but the prospect of war is hanging over the United States for at least 20 years, right? Now, how much of this push then of social reformers to go back to this fictional ideal world where people ate with their families all the time and everything was perfect?
Never happened.
Which never existed. So how much is that push then motivated by the social tensions and the political tensions and maybe just a fear of what's going on around the country and trying to retreat to the home and to this perceived safer environment?
I think that definitely when the war is actually going on, I think that there is some feeling that we should not indulge, we should sort of sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I can only speak really from a northern perspective because that's what I've done my research, where I've done my research. But before the war, I don't know that necessarily played a huge part in what these reformers were saying. However, there are some interesting tensions over slavery that do play out in the restaurant, particularly regarding black waiters. So waitering was actually it was a really popular occupation for black men in northern cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and it was actually considered one of the best occupations that a black man could hold in this time period because they were discriminated against even in the North and they did not have the same opportunities as white men. But there are people who maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable about being served by a black man. And there's some, discussion about what makes the black waiter different from, particularly within the black community, what makes what we're doing in Boston different from what the black slave is doing in Georgia or whatever, because it's a service occupation. And people like David Walker and some other black reformers urge African Americans to, move out of the service occupations. On the other hand, there's also conversation about sort of celebrating black waiters as hard workers who are being paid for what they're doing. They're not slaves. And actually, there's a really interesting story about a waiter, Shadrach Minkins, in Boston. He escaped from slavery in Virginia, where he had worked as a waiter in his master's hotel in Norfolk. He escapes to Boston, and he gets a job at a restaurant in Boston. So, that's interesting. He's doing the same work that he had been doing as a slave, but now he's getting paid for it. Right. And he's actually apprehended by slave catchers in 1851. This is very quickly after the Second Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And he's apprehended, and he's taken to the courthouse, and he's going to be forcibly removed to the South. And Boston just has this huge uproar about it because they're opposed to slavery, they're opposed to the Fugitive Slave Act, and they use Shadrach kind of as a symbol of, this is a hard-working man who is just trying to do his job. We should respect the dignity of his labor and not allow him to be re-enslaved. And so this interracial mob actually storms the courthouse and they rescue Shadrach and they help him escape to Canada. Actually.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So these issues that are playing out nationally over race and slavery do sort of play a role.
Oh, definitely.
Locally.
Yes. And also, ethnicity too, with waves of immigrants coming in, and they bring their food cultures, and a lot of the
especially a city like Boston, right?
Yeah,
a lot of
Irish are huge. Later, you have other maybe more exotic cultures, and a lot of the first tastes Americans get of those ethnic cuisines are in restaurants.
So over time, the restaurant industry, can we call it industry at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a fair term, although it's not, it's not as incorporated by any stretch of the imagination as it is today.
So the restaurant industry starts to respond to some of these concerns from these social reformers. So what are some of the changes that they make to make the restaurant experience or the concept of going to a restaurant, just for the lack of a better term, a little less taboo?
For the middle class in particular,
yeah,
you mean?
For the middle class in particular.
So the middle class who had kind of found that their needs, their domestic values, their family values weren't necessarily met by restaurants. The restaurants as businesses do start to respond to some of those concerns to try to make their businesses more appealing to middle class families. And there's actually a really good book that was published recently by Andrew Haley. It's called Turning the Tables, and he looks at the early 20th century and argues that the middle class really became a big factor in the restaurant business as we know it today. But even earlier, sort of in the 1850s and 1860s, restaurants begin to start welcoming mixed gender parties, men and women together. Mm-hmm. Slowly, children become more involved. They start advertising. This is a bit later, perhaps, but they start advertising the home-cooked meal as a lure to draw people in. So I think those are some of the ways that the restaurants
So it sort of turns into this place for the family meal. Mm-hmm. It sort of slowly develops into what the social reformers want.
Yeah, and
in a sense,
right? You can see the middle class sort of playing a larger role in dictating American culture.
Right. As restaurants make these changes to make them more family-oriented and make themselves more acceptable, it speaks to a larger question that I would have is, like, where is this romanticism for the family meal coming from? You talk about it in the American context. I grew up in Canada, and we had Sunday dinners, and it was a big deal for us as a family. The other presentation this morning talked about Japan and the family meals in Japan, working on farms as people were on exchange there. Working on these farms, the romanticism of that. Why is there this longing for the family meal, this nostalgia associated? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's still the same sort of confluence of factors that originated the idea of the family meal in the early 19th century. It's as our lives, like all over the world, become more driven by market work forces. We don't spend as much time at home. We don't spend as much time interacting with our families, for good or ill. But I think that
a little both, probably.
I think, yeah. I think that the idea of the family meal, it has become some sort of bulwark, at least imagined as a bulwark against what we perceive as negatives of the modern world. Excess, being too busy, working too hard, anonymity in so much of our relationships, decline of morality, family time, that kind of thing. And the family meal provides a way to sort of, even if we're not engaging in it, even if we're just talking about how great it is, I think it just makes us feel better.
Right. And there's, I guess maybe there's even a certain practicality to it. I think Jerry Seinfeld has a bit that at some point the only thing you can do with your parents is eat. That is, it does provide entertainment and structure, I guess. Yeah. Christmas with my family, oftentimes, it's just, as soon as you get there, there's a plate of food, and you're just eating the whole time. And in my family, it would be as soon as you get there, there's a glass of something for you to drink. A drink in your hand. But yeah, it is. It's interesting how food is this socializing force, as opposed to a way to sustain yourself and to not die, right? To fuel your body. It's really a socializing. Oh yeah, I know. It's a way to convey values. Yeah. It's a way to convey order. Totally. So, University of Minnesota Press. Yes. Book contract right now. Congratulations. Very exciting. Hopefully should be out 2014-ish. And the title, working title, right? Because this might titles change. It could change. But, it's a good title. Yeah, so Public Appetite, Boston and the Rise of Dining Out in America. So you can look for that hopefully next year at some point. So that's so thanks for doing this. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's been fun. I appreciate it. So that's Kelly Erby from Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. I didn't know where that is. That's why I'm saying Topeka, Kansas. Right in the middle of the country. It's the heartland. Yes. That's what we like. It's the capital of Kansas. Topeka. There we go. And if anyone has questions for Kelly, Kelly Erby at washburn.edu. That's Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, Erby, E-R-B-Y, at washburn.edu. I'll put that up as part of my blog post as well. Thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, and before we go, we want to talk to Heather Moore, producer of Northern Scene at the National Arts Center. Welcome.
Hi.
So what we're doing here, we want to talk about Northern Scene a little bit. We're also announcing at ActiveHistory.ca our Northern History Week, which will be the week of April 29th. We're going to have historians of the North writing pieces about the North, and this is corresponding with Northern Scene.
Right.
And I've been doing some podcasts, and we're going to run the podcast during the week, and it's going to be a whole big Festival of the North, which we're very excited about. So your part with Northern Scene here at the National Arts Center, just a general overview of what is Northern Scene.
Northern Scene. Okay, so Northern Scene is actually the sixth in a series of these scene festivals, and they began back in 2003, and the idea for them began back in 2001. It began with our wonderful Peter Herndorf, who's the CEO of the NAC, and he had recently come on board to a national arts center that was behaving anything but national, really. That throughout sort of funding cuts and of the 90s, we'd really become more of a local organization and really hadn't been sort of working on that national part of our mandate. So he got us to change our vision to really include national in what we did, and we started doing a lot of things differently around the NAC. And the orchestra toured a lot more, like the tour we just did of the North to sort of come around the circle there. But that was us going out, and so we said, well, what if we invited and celebrated Canadian artists from one coast to the other, and had them all here for festivals. So we started in 2003 with an Atlantic scene, and everybody thought we were nuts. And we went down there and said, how would you all like to come for a festival? And they didn't believe that. Anyway, it was brilliant. It was great. We had hundreds of artists in all these disciplines come, and it was the beginning of something great. So we followed up, and we've been doing them every 2 years, and it was Northern Scene turn for 2013.
So it started Atlantic,
Alberta in 2005, then Quebec in 2007, BC in 2009, Prairies in 2011, and now the North in 2013.
Wow! So I was one of the volunteers at Prairie Scene in 2011, wonderful. Which was terrific, and I really enjoyed it. So if this is anything like that, it'll be a great festival.
Well, that's interesting because when you say this is going to be anything like that, so the premise is that we're going to bring the greatest sort of artists that have established and emerging a real contemporary snapshot, but everyone is different, and we don't go into programming them with any sort of fixed pattern because we want to go there and discover. We don't want to say that Ottawa knows what the scene is in the North or knows what the scene is in the Prairies. So we really sort of take our time and spend a lot of time there and try to make sure that we really are getting it. We're understanding, and we talk and meet and see and listen and taste and do as much as we can to make sure that we're capturing a really contemporary portrait of the North.
So to that end, you've been to the North. How many times would you say you've gone?
Probably a dozen times.
Okay.
And some of my colleagues have been up even more. So I'd love to be up there even more. But it's a very jam-packed days. So getting up there and trying to meet as many people as I can. My first trip was to Nunavut back in 2010. And I went up for the Alionite Festival and took a side trip up to Cape Dorset. And that was a real eye-opener. I mean, the North is not a place that I'd ever traveled on my own. So unlike, Vancouver or even Winnipeg, places that I had been through, either through work or for pleasure, I had never been to the North. So
in doing this then, I mean, I think we all have our ideas of what the North is. I mean, one time I was at a presentation about Arctic sovereignty, and the question was something like, there's 20 people and 30 polar bears. Why do we care?
Yeah, right.
So there's this perception of this barren place with not really anything going on. Now, in going up over the past few years, how has your perception of the North changed?
Oh, well, yeah, it's, you try not to go in with any sort of stereotypes of what a region is, but until you've experienced it, you really don't know.
Right.
I had, and it's very different. Nunavut is dramatically different from the Yukon. So what you experience in one part of the North is very, very different than the other. But, I really fell in love with Nunavut. Iqaluit was amazing. I mean, it's often the people that I meet. I mean, the landscape is different. It reminded me a lot of Newfoundland, actually, the sort of barrenness of a lot of the rock and up and around Iqaluit and Cape Dorset. But it often ends up being the people and the experiences that you meet. And everywhere, I must admit, was a real openness to receiving us. And I think they're very particularly welcome for people from the South to come up and say, hey, we're interested. We want to know more about you.
Yeah. So what sort of stuff can we expect with the scene? What sort of performances? What sort of what if I'm coming to to the scene as a whole.
Okay, what are you going to see?
What am I going to see? What am I expecting?
Absolutely.
What am I going to
Well,
get?
people say that same thing. So you're not bringing throat singers, are you? Well, actually, we are. But they're in a totally different context. I mean, the thing that's happening with current contemporary artists up there is they're working with traditional forms in many cases, but using them in very contemporary contexts. So we had a wonderful artist here for our launch named Nelson Taguna, who's from Baker Lake, which is actually the geographic center of Canada. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
That tells you how far. I mean, the north. We
It
think
goes
it goes way up.
Oh,
There's
man.
a lot of north. Anyway, he's like a 19-year-old kid who's used Inuit throat singing to develop his own style of throat boxing, beatboxing, which he calls throat boxing.
Yes.
So there's sort of a totally contemporary example. People are very, I think. I bet if we had done this festival 15 years ago, it would be different. But the fact that the North is so connected with the internet and there's so many influences coming in now, just find that the artists up there have a real kind of global perspective, and they're bringing that to their work. So I think people are going to be surprised at how contemporary everything is.
Right.
I think that they may think it's what they've seen in sort of traditional folkloric type things, but they're good.
Throat singing in drum circles.
Exactly, and we are doing drum circles, and we are doing throat singing, but the context that it's being presented in, and the artists and their vision and how they're doing it. I mean, it's incorporated into other art forms. It's incorporated into stories, and there's some very hip, wonderful contemporary things that are going to be happening. So I think they should just sample. I think they should not go by sort of, I have heard of this person or haven't, because they probably haven't. But they should take a chance, and they can trust that what we're bringing them really is the best.
Yeah, because you said at the volunteer events that it's different from other ones because you're not using South Southern Hall for these large shows the way that you did with
Diana Krall or Randy Bachman or so on. So there are often iconic names that are sort of symbolize what a region is known for. You sort of think of Newfoundland, where I'm from, and you think of Great Big Sea or something, and you sort of get this idea in your head.
Right.
So I don't know if people, I think they may think of, I think a lot of people think of Inuit sculpture when they think of the North, and that's just a small portion of what's going on. But even within that, I mean, we've got a sculpture at the Carleton University Art Exhibit, had their opening last night, and it's this amazing electric guitar that Jamisi Tuna did. It's incredible, right down to the ivory pegs, tuning pegs, and the sealskin strap. There's sculptures of and the printmaking is of very contemporary issues. It's not all the sort of traditional things that we've seen. They're using their art in very contemporary ways. So, and there's a real joy and passion to it too.
Yeah.
I mean, the artists that are coming from the North are all doing this for the love of what they're doing, and that's really infectious.
Yeah, and I think because it's in these, and with all due respect to South Southern Hall, I like the smaller venues.
Oh,
it's
definitely.
a more intimate experience.
Yeah.
I think you get there's more connection with the artist. They can connect to the crowd and get a better feel from the crowd.
I think I have to agree with you. It's when you get to know the artist and who they are. Now, I do have to admit, there is one show in Southern Hall, but you talk about getting connected. What we are doing a drum circle.
It's the drum circle,
Yeah, it's Spirit of the Drums. We're bringing drum groups from the Yukon, 2 from the Yukon and 2 from Northwest Territories, and a group from Nunavut and a group from Nunatsiavut. And they're all working together, and they're working on a performance and a sharing of their stories. But what we're going to do is the whole performance and the audience will all be on Southern Hall stage. Right. So there are more than 40 drummers and dancers that are going to be performing in this. It's about a 45-minute show, and the audience is going to be sitting in around them as part of it. So even within that venue, it's going to be very up close and personal.
Yeah, we talk about sort of the motivation of art and why do artists do what they do, and you sort of hinted that these individuals are not rich off of what they do, that they really do it for the passion and for the love of it. And sort of how does this art represent the North? And what are they saying about the region in pursuing this?
That's interesting. I think that openness and freshness and vitality is part of a lot of the work there. I think there's no escaping that the land features in almost all the work, whether it's visual art or theater or dance. You do see, they're very, very aware of the climate and the land, and there's kind of not a reverence, but there's a very special relationship that people in the North have to the place,
right?
To where they are, and I think that comes through in a lot of their work. But then there's also a kind of getting beyond that too. I mean, there's no, it's not stereotyping the North to say it gets cold and dark, because it does. And then there's this kind of celebratory aspect to what a lot of them do that and a kind of wackiness. Like we've got this show called The Grub Stake Revisited, which is a group from the Yukon that took a Nell Shipman 22 or 23 black and white film from a Yukon gold rush. Girl goes north, and there's sort of dastardly this and all this sort of adventure. And they stripped it down, and they took out all the dialogue, and they rewrote it all from Shakespeare, and then they decided to do a soundscape and got a bunch of really cool musicians together and decided they'd redo that. I could just imagine them sitting around in the cold drinking beer somewhere saying, what if we did this? Like you've got to, and I think a lot of those ideas, there's a cabin fever night, which... that
one sounds really interesting.
Well, they say it's not cabin. They say it's the cure for cabin fever, which
because
is just...
it's the spring. You can come outside again.
Yes, and they say that what they do when it gets dark is they have these kind of cool jam sessions in a bar, and so there's that kind of thing going on. So I think there's that spirit of it as well. And then you've got people like Art Cirque who are doing circus on ice flows. I mean, they work out of this is the circus company, the Glulik, and they're working in their black box studio is the back end of a hockey rink where the curling sheets used to be, and they've made a black box theater, and that's where they perform, and they bring it for youth to have something to do on those cold, dark times, and so that they're not sort of left with at loose ends, and they've got a creative outlet. So so I think there's the land, and then there's the climate, and then there's rising above that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's really this vibrance that's really going to come through in this festival.
There's energy and vibrance and just kind of joy in a lot of sense. I know you hear a lot of stories from the North, and there are challenges in communities, and lots of artists are addressing that as well in their work. But there's also a celebration of the art and who the people are, and I think that comes through even stronger. So
tickets, information, where are people going?
They go to northernscene.ca. Okay. They follow us on Twitter, and they like us on Facebook, and they get this amazing Northern Scene Pass, which is 4 shows for $40. You absolutely can't beat that. No. And that, I'd say get the pass and then go through and pick out some shows. Don't miss Grub Stake. Don't miss Tanya Tagak with her movie. Don't try out some of the music shows. Go and see Justice, was this wonderful play of the based on the archaeological find of the Nantuk brothers in the North. There's a lot to sample, and you can't go wrong.
Yeah, actually, I was at a conference last week in Washington, and this guy from somewhere in the South, I don't know where, but he was talking about Nanook of the North.
Yeah.
And in his presentation, I'm like, this is crazy. This is coming from Northern Scene as part of the festival, and this guy in the South is talking about it. It's amazing. That's and actually, you talked about themes going on, but it's that reinterpreting some of the old stuff. That would have to be the other theme that's coming through, whether it's Grub Stake or what Tanya's doing with this also 1920s film that had this sort of stereotypic, or what we grew to feel was some sort of stereotype vision of Inuit life, and then bringing a very fresh and contemporary view to that. So I think that's another sort of spin to how the artists are bringing work to the scene. Yeah, it's going to be a great festival, and also a bunch of stuff that's for free, too. Oh, tons of stuff for free. I mean, the 4 for $40 is just part of it, but you can really take in a lot. Swarm, April 26th. Go out, see as many of the 15 shows as you can. Come back to a great fashion show, party, urban, hip-hop, cool party at the NAC, and that'll just set you off. Yeah, so, Festival of Northern Scene, April 25th through May the 4th. Throughout Ottawa, and it's not just at the National Arts Center, stuff going on across the city, across the capital, the national capital region. Across the river as well. So that's Heather Moore, Executive Director and Producer of Northern Scene. Thanks for doing this. Thanks, Sean. So I would like to thank Heather Moore. I'd also like to thank Carla Wolf, Marnie Richardson, Laura Denker, and we're excited here at ActiveHistory.ca for Northern History Week to kick this off. And we're kicking our week off on April the 29th, and with different features from various historians of the North and different podcasts. We're really excited about it. I'd also like to thank, real quick, Kelly Erby for being on the first part of this podcast. I thought she was terrific. If you have any questions, comments for the podcast, you can find me, historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever, and if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.